To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Matthew Wilson had built his life on simple principles. Work hard, provide for family, and trust those you love. At 43, he owned a successful construction company in Denver, Colorado, employing 37 men who respected him for his fairness and unwavering integrity. His calloused hands told the story of a man who'd started with nothing but determination, building his empire one foundation at a time. The Wilson household on Maple Street was his pride, a 3-story colonial he designed and built himself for Clara, his wife of 19 years, and their 18-year-old daughter Haley. Clara had been a real estate agent when they met, ambitious and charming, with auburn hair and green eyes that could convince anyone to buy a house they couldn't afford. Now she worked part-time at a boutique downtown, claiming she wanted to focus on personal fulfillment rather than the demanding schedule of property sales. Matthew never questioned her reduced hours or the frequent girls' nights that stretched past midnight. Trust was the cornerstone of their marriage, and he'd never given Clara reason to doubt him. He assumed the same courtesy extended both ways. Haley had inherited her mother's striking features, but possessed her father's stubborn determination. A senior at Roosevelt High, she was everything Matthew had hoped for in a daughter: smart, driven, and accepted to Colorado State University for the fall. Her 18th birthday was approaching, and Matthew had secretly been planning to surprise her with the red Mustang convertible she'd been eyeing at the local dealership. The warning signs had been there for months, subtle shifts in routine that Matthew's logical mind explained away. Clara's newfound interest in yoga classes 3 times a week. The way she guarded her phone, keeping it face down during dinner and taking it everywhere, even to the bathroom. Her sudden fascination with wine tastings with her book club friends, events that apparently never included actual books. Stephen Waters had entered their lives 18 months ago as Clara's yoga instructor at Sacred Balance Studio. Matthew had met him twice, once at a community barbecue and again at Haley's birthday party last year. Stephen was everything Matthew wasn't. Lean where Matthew was broad, smooth where Matthew was weathered, and philosophical where Matthew was practical. At 35, Stephen possessed the kind of effortless charm that made women laugh at jokes that weren't particularly funny. Matthew remembered shaking Stephen's hand at that barbecue, noting the man's soft palms and wondering how someone made a living teaching people to stretch. Stephen had mentioned his holistic approach to wellness and his plans to open a retreat center in the mountains. Clara had hung on every word, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm Matthew hadn't seen in years. The first real crack in Matthew's foundation of trust came 3 weeks before his birthday. He'd returned home early from a job site, hoping to surprise Clara with lunch from her favorite Italian place. Her car was in the driveway, but she wasn't answering her phone. When he entered the house, he found her in the living room, quickly ending a call and claiming it was just her sister Eliza discussing their mother's health. But Matthew had heard enough of the conversation to know Clara's voice when she was lying. The breathless quality, the way she dropped her voice to almost a whisper. She'd used that same tone years ago when planning his surprise 40th birthday party. This time, however, the conversation hadn't been about celebrations. The second crack appeared when Matthew noticed Clara had started working out more intensely, buying expensive athletic wear and protein supplements. She claimed it was part of her wellness journey, but Matthew observed that her newfound dedication to fitness coincided perfectly with Stephen's class schedule. When he casually mentioned joining her for a workout, Clara had quickly deflected, claiming the classes were too beginner-level for someone with his strength. The foundation of Matthew's trust finally cracked completely on the morning of March 15th, exactly 3 weeks before his birthday. Haley had cornered him in his home office, her face flushed with excitement about something she called the most amazing opportunity ever. "Dad, you're going to think this is crazy, but Stephen, you remember Mom's yoga instructor? He's organizing this incredible spiritual retreat in Hawaii. It's only for 2 weeks, and Mom thinks it would be perfect for me before college starts. To find myself and gain some life perspective." Matthew had looked up from his construction blueprints, studying his daughter's animated expression. "Hawaii's expensive, sweetheart. When is this retreat?" "It starts April 6th, right after spring break." "I know it's short notice, but someone else canceled, and Stephen offered Mom the spot for me. It's like fate, you know? And the best part is, it's only $19,000 for both of us. Mom said you'd probably think it's worth it for my personal growth. $19,000. Matthew's birthday was April 5th. Both of you? Matthew had asked carefully, his hand tightening around his pencil. Yeah, Mom's going too. She says she needs some spiritual renewal, and this is the perfect mother-daughter bonding experience before I leave for college. Stephen will be leading meditation sessions and teaching us about finding our inner purpose. Isn't that amazing? Matthew had forced a smile, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with money. Clara had never shown interest in meditation. She'd never expressed desire for mother-daughter bonding. And Stephen Waters was apparently conducting private retreats in Hawaii at the exact time of Matthew's birthday. That does sound amazing, Matthew had said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. When do you need the money? Mom said if you could transfer it today, she can book everything this afternoon. Stephen says these spots fill up super fast. Matthew had nodded, watching his daughter's eyes sparkle with anticipation. Haley genuinely believed this was about spiritual growth and family bonding. She had no idea she was being used as the perfect cover for her mother's affair. That evening, Matthew had transferred $19,000 to Clara's account without question or comment. When Clara mentioned the trip at dinner, her explanation matched Haley's story word for word. They'd rehearsed well. I think it's wonderful, Matthew had said, raising his wine glass in a toast to new experiences and spiritual growth. Clara had beamed, leaning over to kiss his cheek. You're the most understanding husband in the world, Matthew. I love you so much. The kiss had felt like a knife sliding between his ribs. Matthew Wilson had built his life on trust, but he wasn't naive. He knew the difference between faith and foolishness. As he sat in his office that night, listening to Clara and Haley excitedly plan their trip, he realized his foundation hadn't just cracked, it had shattered completely. But Matthew Wilson was a builder. He knew how to tear down structures that were no longer sound and construct something stronger in their place. The difference was, this time he wouldn't be building with trust. He'd be building with truth. Chapter 2. The Architect of Deception. The next morning, Matthew began his investigation with the methodical precision that had made his construction company successful. He'd learned long ago that rushing into any project without proper planning led to disaster. This project would require the same careful attention to detail, except the stakes were infinitely higher than any building he'd ever constructed. Clara left for her yoga class at 9:30, kissing Matthew goodbye with the same affectionate smile she'd worn for 19 years. Haley was at school, her final semester of senior year, keeping her busy with college preparations and graduation activities. Matthew had deliberately cleared his schedule, telling his foreman Phil Cobb that he was taking the day to handle personal business. The Sacred Balance studio was located in a converted warehouse in Denver's trendy Lodo district. Matthew parked across the street, his truck inconspicuous among the construction vehicles servicing the neighborhood's ongoing gentrification. He had a clear view of the studio's entrance and the parking lot behind the building. Clara's silver BMW arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, parking in her usual spot near the back entrance. Matthew had expected this. Clara was punctual to a fault, a trait that had served her well in real estate and was now serving him equally well in his investigation. What Matthew hadn't expected was to see Stephen Waters exit the building immediately after Clara entered, walking to his own car with the casual confidence of a man completely secure in his deception. Stephen drove a black Jeep Wrangler, the kind of vehicle that suggested adventure and spontaneity, everything Matthew represented in Clara's mind that Stephen didn't. Matthew followed at a distance as Stephen drove through downtown Denver, eventually pulling into the parking garage of the Marriott Hotel on 17th Street. This wasn't a coincidence or a brief errand. Stephen had checked into a room. 30 minutes later, Clara emerged from the garage elevator, walking through the hotel lobby with her head down, sunglasses covering her eyes despite being indoors. She moved with purpose, but without her usual confident stride. Matthew recognized guilt when he saw it, even disguised behind designer clothes and careful makeup. They stayed in the hotel for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Matthew timed it precisely, making notes in the small notebook he always carried for construction measurements. When Clara finally returned to her car, her hair was slightly disheveled, and she checked her reflection in the side mirror before driving away. Matthew followed her back to the studio, where she retrieved her yoga mat from her trunk, a prop that had never been unrolled, and walked inside for what he assumed was the cooling-down period of her fictional class. The other women in the actual yoga class were just finishing their session, emerging from the building with the flushed, satisfied expressions of people who'd actually exercised. Clara stayed inside for another 20 minutes, probably showering and preparing to return home, with her carefully constructed story about challenging poses and spiritual enlightenment. When she finally emerged, she looked exactly like someone returning from an intense workout, complete with appropriately tousled hair and a slight sheen of manufactured perspiration. The investigation continued for 2 weeks. Matthew documented every lie, every deception, every moment of calculated betrayal. Clara and Stephen had a routine as predictable as Matthew's construction schedule. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings at the hotel. Tuesday evenings at Stephen's apartment on Compass Street. Saturday afternoons at a cabin in Evergreen that Stephen apparently rented for private meditation sessions. The depth of planning involved in their affair was almost impressive. Clara had constructed an entire alternate reality, complete with alibis, witnesses, and props. She'd recruited friends to corroborate her yoga stories, scheduled actual appointments around her betrayal, and maintained perfect emotional compartmentalization at home. But Matthew discovered something else during his investigation, something that transformed his anger into something far more dangerous. This wasn't just an affair. It was a complete reconstruction of Clara's life with him written out of it. At Stephen's apartment, Matthew observed Clara carrying an overnight bag on Tuesday evenings. She was essentially living 2 separate lives, spending one night a week as Stephen's girlfriend and the rest of the time as Matthew's wife. When Matthew discreetly examined their joint credit card statements, he found charges for expensive dinners, couples massages, and weekend getaways that Clara had explained as girls' trips or solo retreat days. Most damaging of all, Matthew discovered that Stephen's planned retreat center wasn't just a pipe dream. Using his business connections, Matthew learned that Stephen had already secured investors and purchased land in Colorado's mountain region. The Hawaii trip wasn't a retreat. It was a scouting expedition for Stephen's business, funded by Matthew's money and disguised as spiritual growth for his wife and daughter. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Maynard Mora, who handled security for several downtown Denver hotels, was a client of Matthew's construction company. During a casual conversation about a renovation project, Maynard mentioned seeing Matthew's wife at the Marriott several times with some yoga guy. Didn't want to say anything, Maynard had said, clearly uncomfortable. But they weren't exactly acting like business partners, if you know what I mean. Hope I'm not speaking out of turn. Matthew had thanked Maynard for his discretion and assured him that Matthew was aware of the situation. It wasn't entirely a lie. Matthew was now aware of everything. The night before Clara and Haley's departure to Hawaii, Matthew sat in his office reviewing the evidence he'd compiled. Photographs, credit card statements, hotel records, and a detailed timeline of 18 months of systematic deception. Clara hadn't just broken their marriage vows. She'd created an entirely fictional version of their life together. But what cut deepest was Haley's unwitting participation in the charade. Clara had used their daughter as cover, exploiting Haley's trust and excitement about college to provide legitimacy for her betrayal. Haley genuinely believed she was embarking on a spiritual journey with her mother. Instead, she was providing Clara with the perfect alibi for an extended romantic getaway with her lover. Matthew closed the folder containing his evidence and locked it in his office safe. Tomorrow, Clara and Haley would leave for Hawaii, believing they'd successfully deceived him. They would spend 9 days in paradise, funded by his labor and built on his trust. But they would return to discover that Matthew Wilson wasn't the fool they'd taken him for. He was an architect of destruction now, and he was about to teach them the difference between trust and stupidity. The foundation of their deception was solid, but Matthew had found the structural weaknesses. And unlike the buildings he constructed to last generations, this particular structure was designed to collapse catastrophically. He just needed to wait for the right moment to remove the supporting beams. Chapter 3. The Blueprint for Destruction. The morning of April 5th, Matthew's 43rd birthday, arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado spring weather that made promises of new beginnings. Clara and Haley bustled around the house, packing last-minute items and checking their flight information with the excited energy of people embarking on a grand adventure. Matthew sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching his wife and daughter prepare for their trip. To any observer, he appeared relaxed and supportive, occasionally offering practical advice about travel documents and weather expectations. Inside, however, he was conducting final calculations for the most important project of his life. "Dad, are you sure you're going to be okay alone for your birthday?" Haley asked, pausing in her packing to study his face with genuine concern. "I feel terrible about leaving you on your special day." Matthew smiled, the expression coming more easily than it should have. "Sweetheart, birthdays are just dates on a calendar. What matters is that you and your mother have this experience together. Besides, I'll be busy with the Morrison Hotel project. Phil and I need to finalize the foundation work before the inspection next week." Clara looked up from her suitcase, her green eyes bright with what Matthew now recognized as anticipation rather than concern. "Matthew's always been understanding about my schedule," she said, walking over to kiss his cheek. "That's why I married him. He never makes me feel guilty for pursuing my own interests." The irony of her statement was so profound that Matthew had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. Clara had no idea how extensively she'd revealed her interests during his investigation. She genuinely believed she was subtle, that her careful planning and elaborate lies had fooled him completely. "Have you heard from Stephen about the retreat details?" Matthew asked casually, testing the waters of their deception one final time. Haley nodded enthusiastically. "He sent Mom the complete itinerary yesterday. Daily meditation sessions, hiking excursions to sacred sites, and something called Inner Truth workshops. I'm actually nervous about whether I'm spiritually ready for such an intense experience." Matthew caught Clara's eyes over Haley's head, watching for any sign of discomfort or guilt. Instead, he saw only practiced confidence. Clara had compartmentalized so completely that she could discuss Stephen's plans for their romantic getaway while looking directly at her husband without flinching. "I'm sure you'll both discover things about yourselves you never knew existed," Matthew said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to sound sincere. At noon, Matthew drove them to Denver International Airport, helping carry their luggage and walking them to the security checkpoint. Clara hugged him goodbye with what felt like genuine affection, whispering that she loved him and would miss him. Haley's embrace was tighter, filled with the kind of daughterly love that made Matthew's chest ache with the knowledge of how thoroughly Clara had manipulated their child. "Take care of yourself while we're gone," Clara said, her hand resting on Matthew's chest. "Don't work too hard, and don't forget to eat actual meals instead of just coffee and sandwiches." "I promise to take good care of myself," Matthew replied, and for the first time in weeks, he was telling the complete truth. After they disappeared through security, Matthew returned to his truck and sat in the airport parking garage for 30 minutes, allowing the reality of his situation to settle completely. Clara and Haley were gone. For the next 9 days, he would be alone with his knowledge and his plans. The first phase of Matthew's blueprint required establishing his own alibi and emotional state. He drove to Sacred Balance Studio, where he informed the receptionist that he was concerned about his wife's sudden departure and wanted to verify the retreat details. The young woman behind the desk looked confused. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson, but Stephen isn't conducting any retreats right now. He's actually on vacation himself. Said something about visiting Hawaii to scout locations for a future project. Maybe your wife meant a different instructor." Matthew feigned surprise and concern, explaining that there must be some miscommunication. He left his contact information, asking them to call if they heard from Stephen or had any information about retreats. The receptionist promised to investigate and contact him with any updates. Next, Matthew visited his lawyer, Ezra Wong, at his downtown office. Ezra had handled the legal work for Matthew's construction company and had become a friend over the years. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and shared values about honesty and hard work. "Ezra, I need to discuss some personal legal matters," Matthew said, settling into the chair across from his lawyer's desk. "It's about my marriage." Ezra's expression grew serious. "What kind of personal matters, Matthew?" Matthew retrieved a folder from his briefcase, not the comprehensive evidence file locked in his safe, but a carefully selected subset of documents. Bank records showing the $19,000 transfer. Hotel receipts from his investigation. Photographs of Clara and Stephen entering the Marriott together. My wife is having an affair, Matthew said simply. She's currently in Hawaii with her lover, and she's taken our daughter as cover for the trip. I need to understand my legal options. Ezra examined the documents with the careful attention to detail that made him an excellent attorney. His expression grew more grim with each piece of evidence. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied Matthew's face. This is comprehensive documentation, Matthew. How long have you known? I've suspected for months, but I've had definitive proof for 2 weeks. I wanted to be absolutely certain before taking any action. Have you confronted Clara about this? Matthew shook his head. I see no point in confrontation until I understand the full scope of my situation. I need to know how to protect my assets, my business, and my relationship with Haley. I also need to understand what happens if Clara decides to leave me for Stephen. Ezra nodded, making notes on a legal pad. Colorado is a no-fault divorce state, so the affair itself won't impact property division significantly. However, the fact that she's using marital assets to fund her relationship with another man could be considered dissipation of marital property. The $19,000 for this trip, combined with these hotel and restaurant charges, represents a pattern of using joint resources for her affair. What about my business? Wilson Construction was established before your marriage, and you've maintained separate business accounts. Your company should be protected as long as marital funds weren't used for significant business investments. We need to review your financial records more thoroughly. Matthew had expected this answer. He'd been meticulous about keeping his business finances separate from personal accounts, a decision that had once been about organization but now proved strategically valuable. I want you to prepare divorce papers, Matthew said. Complete financial separation, custody arrangements for Haley, though she's 18 now, so that's less relevant. And I want documentation of Clara's affair and misuse of marital assets. Matthew, are you certain about this course of action? Marriage counseling might. Ezra, my wife has been living a double life for over a year. She's manipulated our daughter into providing cover for her affair. She's stolen our money to fund romantic getaways with another man. The marriage is over. I'm just deciding how it ends. Ezra had worked with Matthew long enough to recognize his tone. When Matthew spoke with that particular quiet intensity, arguing was pointless. Matthew had made his decision with the same careful consideration he applied to construction projects. I'll need a few days to prepare everything properly, Ezra said. When do you want Clara served with papers? Matthew checked his calendar, calculating the timeline precisely. Clara and Haley returned from Hawaii on Sunday, April 14th. I want Clara served with divorce papers on Monday morning, April 15th. Can you arrange for service at the house around 10 a.m.? That's very specific timing. I want Clara to have exactly 1 day to settle back into her normal routine before her world changes completely. I want her to wake up Monday morning thinking she successfully deceived me, and then I want that illusion shattered permanently. Ezra made additional notes, his expression thoughtful. What about Haley? How do you plan to handle this with your daughter? This was the question Matthew had been dreading, the one aspect of his plan that caused genuine pain rather than cold satisfaction. Haley was innocent in all of this, a victim of her mother's manipulation. But she was also 18 years old, legally an adult, and would soon discover that her spiritual retreat had been an elaborate cover for her mother's affair. I'll tell Haley the truth, Matthew said. All of it. She deserves to know that her mother used her as cover for adultery. She deserves to understand the difference between love and manipulation. That's going to be devastating for her. Less devastating than living with lies. Haley is strong enough to handle the truth. She's not strong enough to build her life on deception, and that's what Clara has been teaching her to do. Matthew left Ezra's office with the legal machinery of his divorce set in motion. The papers would be prepared, the service arranged, and the timeline established. Clara would return from Hawaii believing she'd successfully maintained her double life, only to discover that her deception had been exposed completely. But legal action was only the first phase of Matthew's blueprint. Clara and Stephen had used his trust and his money to build their relationship. Now Matthew would use their betrayal to construct something much more permanent. Consequences. The foundation was set. The supporting structures were in place. Now he just needed to wait for the right moment to trigger the controlled demolition of everything Clara and Stephen thought they'd built together. Matthew Wilson had always been patient when building something meant to last. This destruction would last much longer than any marriage. Chapter 4. The Paradise of Deception. While Matthew methodically constructed his legal framework in Denver, Clara and Haley were discovering that paradise came with complications neither had anticipated. The Maui Grand Resort was everything the promotional materials had promised: sweeping ocean views, infinity pools, and the kind of luxury that made $19,000 seem like a reasonable investment in spiritual growth. What Clara hadn't expected was how difficult it would be to maintain the mother-daughter bonding narrative while conducting an affair under her daughter's nose. Stephen had booked connecting rooms for the spiritual retreat participants, a detail that should have simplified their romantic logistics. Instead, it created a constant tension between Clara's desire to spend time with Stephen and her need to maintain the fiction that this trip was about Haley's personal development. "Mom, Stephen seems really nice, but don't you think the meditation sessions are kind of intense?" Haley asked on their second day, as they sat by the pool while Stephen conducted what he called a private spiritual consultation with a female resort guest. Clara watched Stephen through her sunglasses, noting the way he leaned in close to the woman during their conversation, his hand occasionally touching her arm for emphasis. A spike of jealousy surprised her with its intensity. She'd assumed Stephen's attention would be focused entirely on her during their romantic getaway, but she was learning that Stephen's charm wasn't reserved exclusively for her. "Intensity is necessary for real spiritual growth," Clara replied, repeating something Stephen had told her during one of their hotel encounters. "You can't achieve enlightenment through comfort and ease." Haley nodded thoughtfully, but Clara could see doubt creeping into her daughter's expression. Haley was intelligent and observant, traits she'd inherited from Matthew, and the supposed retreat wasn't matching her expectations. The daily meditation sessions were actually Stephen giving Clara private time while Haley explored the resort alone. The Inner Truth workshops consisted of Stephen lecturing about the importance of following your authentic desires, regardless of social expectations or commitments. The closest they'd come to anything resembling a spiritual retreat was a sunrise yoga session on the beach, which had lasted exactly 15 minutes before Stephen claimed the energy wasn't right for deeper practice. By the fourth day, Clara was beginning to understand that she'd misjudged both Stephen's priorities and the complexity of maintaining her deception. Stephen's attention was divided among multiple interests: networking with potential investors for his retreat center, flirting with other resort guests, and conducting what he called research for his business plan. Clara found herself competing for time with a man she'd upended her life to be with. More troubling was Haley's growing skepticism about the entire experience. Her daughter had arrived in Hawaii, genuinely excited about spiritual growth and mother-daughter bonding. Instead, she was spending most of her time alone while Clara snuck off for stolen moments with Stephen. The irony wasn't lost on Clara that in trying to use Haley as cover for her affair, she was actually neglecting her daughter more thoroughly than she ever had at home. "Mom, can we talk?" Haley asked on their fifth evening, after Stephen had excused himself for another networking dinner with resort management. They were sitting on their suite's balcony, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of orange and gold that should have been romantic, but instead felt melancholy. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Haley was quiet for a long moment, organizing her thoughts with the careful precision she'd learned from Matthew. "This isn't really what I expected from a spiritual retreat. Stephen seems nice, but I feel like we're just vacationing. And you seem distracted, like your mind is somewhere else." Clara felt a flutter of panic. If Haley was beginning to suspect something, the carefully constructed alibi for this trip could collapse completely. "I'm sorry if I seem distracted. Sometimes spiritual work brings up complicated emotions. I'm processing a lot of internal growth." "Are you happy, Mom? I mean, really happy? At home? With Dad? With your life?" The question hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the logistics of her affair and the excitement of feeling desired by Stephen that she hadn't considered how her behavior might appear to someone who actually loved her unconditionally. "Why would you ask that?" Clara deflected, buying time to formulate an answer. "Because you've seemed different lately. More secretive, more, I don't know, restless. And this trip doesn't feel like it's about my spiritual growth. It feels like it's about something else entirely." Clara stared out at the ocean, weighing her options. She could continue the deception, maintained the fiction that this was about Haley's development. But her daughter's questions suggested that the lie was becoming transparent. Haley was too smart and too observant to be completely fooled. Sometimes adults need to explore different aspects of themselves, Clara said carefully. Your father is a wonderful man, but he's very stable, predictable. Sometimes I wonder if there are parts of myself I never got to discover because I settled into marriage so young. Haley's expression grew troubled. Are you saying you regret marrying Dad? I'm saying that people change, and sometimes they need to explore what else might be possible. That doesn't mean I don't love your father. It just means I'm trying to understand if the life I'm living is the life I actually want. It was the most honest conversation Clara had with anyone in months, and the relief of partial truth was overwhelming. She'd been carrying the weight of her deception alone, unable to share her feelings with Stephen, who preferred excitement to emotional complexity, or her friends, who wouldn't understand the sophistication of her situation. Does Dad know you feel this way? Clara shook her head. Your father thinks everything is perfect between us. He's happy with our routine, our life, our future plans. He doesn't understand that some people need more than just security and stability. Haley was quiet for several minutes, processing this information with the serious consideration she brought to important decisions. Finally, she looked at her mother with an expression Clara couldn't quite interpret. Mom, I love you, and I want you to be happy. But Dad loves you too, and he deserves to know if you're questioning your marriage. It's not fair to let him think everything is okay if it's not. Clara felt a surge of irritation that her 18-year-old daughter was lecturing her about fairness and honesty. It's more complicated than you understand, Haley. Adult relationships involve nuances that. It's not that complicated, Haley interrupted, her voice carrying a firmness that reminded Clara uncomfortably of Matthew. Either you want to be married to Dad or you don't. Either you're committed to your family or you're not. Everything else is just excuses. The conversation ended in uncomfortable silence, with both women retreating to their respective bedrooms. Clara spent the night staring at the ceiling, questioning for the first time whether her carefully planned affair was worth the growing complexity of maintaining it. Meanwhile, in the adjoining room, Haley lay awake thinking about her father eating alone on his birthday while funding a trip that was supposed to be about spiritual growth but felt more like her mother's personal escape from reality. Neither woman realized that back in Denver, Matthew Wilson was sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, knowing that the legal papers were being prepared and the timeline for revelation was precisely on schedule. The paradise of deception was beginning to show cracks in its foundation. Chapter 5. The cracks begin to show. By the 7th day in Hawaii, the carefully constructed facade of the spiritual retreat was deteriorating rapidly. Stephen had become increasingly distant and preoccupied with his business networking, leaving Clara feeling more like an inconvenient complication than a romantic priority. The woman he'd been conducting spiritual consultations with, a wealthy divorcee named Kimberly Bentley from San Francisco, was receiving far more of his attention than Clara had anticipated. I don't understand why you're being so possessive, Stephen said during one of their rare private moments in his suite. This trip is about more than just our relationship. I'm building something here, establishing connections that could transform my entire business model. Clara sat on the edge of his bed, watching him check his phone for messages from potential investors. This wasn't the romantic getaway she'd envisioned when she convinced Matthew to fund their trip. I thought this time was supposed to be about us. About exploring what our relationship could become without all the sneaking around. Our relationship is part of a larger journey, Clara. You can't separate personal growth from professional opportunity. Kimberly understands that. She's interested in investing in the retreat center, and she appreciates the holistic approach I bring to spiritual development. The way Stephen said Kimberly's name, with a warmth he hadn't used for Clara in days, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She was beginning to recognize a pattern in Stephen's behavior that she'd been too infatuated to notice during their affair in Denver. Stephen's charm was practiced and transferable. The intense attention he'd given Clara during their secret meetings wasn't exclusive or special. It was simply how Stephen operated with women who could benefit his ambitions. Clara had money and social connections in Denver. Kimberly had money and social connections in San Francisco. Both women were useful, and Stephen's romantic interest seemed to correlate directly with their potential value to his business plans. "Are you sleeping with her?" Clara asked bluntly, surprising herself with the question. Stephen looked up from his phone, his expression carefully neutral. That's not the kind of question someone asks when they're operating from a place of spiritual abundance. Jealousy is a limiting emotion, Clara. It comes from scarcity thinking. It wasn't a denial, and they both knew it. Meanwhile, Haley was conducting her own investigation into the nature of their trip. Her mother's revelations about questioning her marriage had left Haley feeling protective of her father and suspicious of the entire Hawaiian adventure. When she tried to book an actual meditation session at the resort spa, she discovered that Stephen Waters wasn't listed as a certified instructor or affiliated with any spiritual organizations. Further inquiries revealed that Stephen was registered as a regular resort guest, not a retreat leader or spiritual guide. The resort staff had no knowledge of any organized spiritual program, and the activities Stephen claimed to be conducting weren't official resort offerings. Haley spent the afternoon at the resort's business center, using her laptop to research Stephen's background more thoroughly. What she discovered made her stomach turn with a combination of anger and fear for her mother. Stephen Waters had a pattern. Over the past 5 years, he'd conducted similar spiritual retreats in various vacation destinations, always funded by wealthy women seeking meaning and personal growth. None of these retreats appeared to be legitimate spiritual programs. Instead, they seemed to be elaborate romantic getaways where Stephen provided emotional intensity and philosophical guidance in exchange for financial support for his various business ventures. Most disturbing was a blog post written by a woman named Viola Galloway from Phoenix, who described being emotionally and financially manipulated by a yoga instructor who promised spiritual transformation but delivered only expensive disappointment and broken promises. The details of Viola's experience matched Clara's situation almost exactly: secret meetings, promises of spiritual growth, and requests for funding for a mountain retreat center that never materialized. Haley printed out the blog post and several other concerning articles about Stephen's past relationships. That evening, she confronted her mother with the evidence. "Mom, we need to talk about Stephen," Haley said, spreading the printed pages on the coffee table in their suite. "I think you're being manipulated." Clara read through the documents with growing horror, recognizing elements of her own experience in every woman's story. The promises about spiritual growth, the requests for financial support, the way Stephen made each woman feel special and chosen while simultaneously pursuing other relationships. "This could be a different Stephen Waters," Clara said weakly, but she knew it wasn't. The photos in the articles clearly showed the same man who'd been conducting spiritual consultations with resort guests all week. "Mom, I think Dad needs to know what's really happening here," Haley said gently. "I think you've gotten involved with someone who's been lying to you about everything." Clara felt her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. The spiritual retreat had been revealed as a fraud. Stephen's romantic interest was clearly divided among multiple women, and her daughter now knew that their entire trip had been based on deception. "You can't tell your father," Clara said, panic creeping into her voice. "He wouldn't understand. This whole situation would destroy our family." "Mom, your affair is what's destroying our family, not Dad finding out about it. He deserves to know that you've been lying to him, and that you've stolen his money to fund a relationship with a con artist." The word affair hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Clara realized that her daughter had figured out much more than she'd admitted during their earlier conversation. Haley wasn't just suspicious about the retreat. She understood exactly what was happening and why they were really in Hawaii. "How long have you known?" Clara asked quietly. "I've suspected since we got here that this wasn't really about spiritual growth. But I didn't understand the full situation until I started researching Stephen. Mom, he's a professional manipulator. He targets women who are questioning their marriages or going through transitions in their lives. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Clara stared at the evidence spread across the coffee table, feeling the full weight of her choices settling on her shoulders. She'd risked her marriage, manipulated her daughter, and stolen from her husband to fund a romantic fantasy with a man who apparently made a living exploiting women exactly like her. "What do I do now?" Clara whispered, more to herself than to Haley. "You tell Dad the truth when we get home," Haley said firmly. You admit what you've done, you apologize for lying to both of us, and you hope he's willing to forgive you. Because the alternative is that he finds out some other way, and then you'll have no chance of saving your marriage. Clara nodded slowly, knowing that Haley was right, but unable to imagine actually confessing her betrayal to Matthew. The idea of seeing disappointment in his eyes, of watching his trust shatter, was almost unbearable. But what Clara didn't know was that Matthew's trust had already shattered completely. While she was discovering Stephen's true nature in Hawaii, Matthew was putting the finishing touches on legal documents that would end their marriage permanently. The timeline was already set. In less than 48 hours, Clara and Haley would board their flight home to Denver. And exactly 24 hours after that, a process server would knock on their door with divorce papers that would make Clara's confessions irrelevant. Matthew Wilson had already moved beyond forgiveness to something far more permanent: justice. Chapter 6: The Return to Reality. The flight from Maui to Denver felt like a journey between two different worlds. Clara spent most of the journey staring out the window, watching the Pacific Ocean give way to the vast expanse of the American continent. Knowing that every mile brought her closer to a reckoning she wasn't prepared to face. Haley sat beside her mother in careful silence, occasionally glancing at Clara with an expression that mixed sympathy with disappointment. The evidence about Stephen's manipulative pattern had changed something fundamental in their relationship. Haley now saw her mother not as a source of wisdom and guidance, but as someone who'd made catastrophically poor decisions that had endangered their entire family. Stephen had barely acknowledged their departure from the resort. When Clara tried to discuss their future plans during their final private moment, he'd been distracted and vague, mentioning that he might be exploring opportunities on the West Coast for the next few months. Kimberly Bentley had apparently offered to introduce him to investors in San Francisco, and Stephen was clearly more interested in that prospect than maintaining his relationship with Clara. "I'll call you when I get back to Denver," Stephen had said. But Clara recognized the tone. It was the same dismissive politeness she'd heard him use with other women throughout the week. She was being discarded with the same casual efficiency that had probably ended his previous affairs. As their plane descended toward Denver International Airport, Clara felt the weight of her situation settling like a physical pressure in her chest. She would have to face Matthew with the knowledge of her betrayal and Stephen's manipulation. She would have to admit that she'd risked everything for a man who'd never actually cared about her. And she would have to do it while watching their marriage dissolve under the weight of her deception. Matthew was waiting at the airport when they arrived, standing near the baggage claim with the patient posture Clara had always found reassuring. He looked exactly the same as when they'd left, solid, dependable, trustworthy, and Clara felt a sharp pang of regret for everything she'd risked losing. "How was the spiritual journey?" Matthew asked, embracing Haley with genuine warmth before giving Clara a brief, polite hug. "It was educational," Haley replied carefully, glancing at her mother. "I learned a lot about the difference between appearances and reality." Matthew's eyes sharpened slightly at Haley's tone, but he didn't pursue the comment. "I'm glad you had meaningful experiences. I've missed you both." During the drive home, Clara found herself studying Matthew's profile, looking for signs that he suspected something about their trip. But his demeanor was exactly what she'd expected: interested in their experiences, concerned about their flight, focused on the practical details of their return. If he had any suspicions about the true nature of their Hawaiian adventure, he was hiding them perfectly. The house on Maple Street looked exactly as they'd left it, but something felt different to Clara. Maybe it was her own guilt creating the sensation, but the familiar rooms seemed smaller somehow, more confining after the expansive luxury of the Maui resort. The family photos on the mantelpiece, images of camping trips, birthday celebrations, and quiet domestic moments, now felt like evidence of a life she'd been willing to abandon for a fantasy. "I'll start some laundry," Clara said, needing something practical to focus on. "And we should probably unpack while everything's fresh in our minds." "Take your time settling back in," Matthew said. "I know travel can be exhausting. I'll order some takeout from that Thai place you like for dinner." His consideration and thoughtfulness made Clara's guilt more acute. While she'd been in Hawaii questioning their marriage and pursuing another man, Matthew had been home taking care of the house and planning ways to make their return comfortable. The contrast between his loyalty and her betrayal was almost unbearable. That evening, As they sat around the dinner table sharing pad thai and spring rolls, Clara tried to imagine how she would begin the conversation about her affair. Every potential opening seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what she needed to confess. How do you tell someone who loves you that you've been systematically lying to them for over a year? How do you explain that their trust and generosity enabled you to pursue a relationship with someone else? Dad, I've been thinking, Haley said, interrupting Clara's internal struggle. I'd like to get a job this summer before college starts. Maybe something in construction or project management, to learn more about your business. Matthew's face lit up with genuine pleasure. I'd love to have you work with the company for a few months. You could start in the office, learning about project planning and client relations, then spend some time on job sites to understand the practical side of construction. Clara watched the interaction between her husband and daughter, seeing clearly for the first time how much Haley admired and respected her father. The idea that her affair might damage Haley's relationship with Matthew added another layer of guilt to her already overwhelming emotional state. That sounds perfect, Haley said. I want to understand how you've built something so successful from nothing. It seems like the kind of lesson they don't teach in college. Matthew reached across the table to squeeze Haley's hand. The most important lesson is that everything worth building requires trust as a foundation. Without trust, even the strongest structures eventually collapse. Clara felt the words like a physical blow. Matthew was speaking to Haley about business principles, but Clara heard her own judgment in his statement. She had violated the foundation of trust that their marriage was built on, and the collapse was inevitable. After dinner, Clara retreated to their bedroom, while Matthew and Haley continued talking about summer work plans and college preparation. She unpacked mechanically, hanging tropical clothes in the closet and placing hotel toiletries in the bathroom, each item a reminder of the deception that had funded their trip. When Matthew finally came to bed, Clara was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair with the same routine she'd followed for 19 years of marriage. In the mirror, she could see Matthew moving through his own bedtime routine, checking the alarm clock, plugging in his phone, setting out clothes for the morning. Matthew, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to talk about some things. He paused in his routine, meeting her eyes in the vanity mirror. What kinds of things? Things about our marriage. About my behavior. About choices I've made that you don't know about. Matthew's expression didn't change, but Clara thought she saw something shift in his eyes. Is this about your relationship with Stephen Waters? The question hit Clara like ice water. She turned to face him directly, her heart racing. How do you know about Stephen? I've known about your affair for weeks, Clara. I know about the hotels, the lies, the way you've been using Haley as cover for your relationship. I know about all of it. Clara felt the room spinning around her. If Matthew had known about her affair for weeks, why had he let them go to Hawaii? Why had he funded the trip? Why was he acting calm and normal instead of angry or devastated? If you knew, why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you confront me before we left? Matthew sat on the edge of their bed, his posture relaxed despite the magnitude of their conversation. Because I needed to understand the full scope of your deception before I decided how to respond. And I needed to give you the opportunity to make your own choices about what you wanted more, your marriage or your affair. What do you mean? I mean that tomorrow morning, you're going to receive some documents that will help clarify our situation permanently. I hope you enjoyed Hawaii, Clara, because it was the last vacation you'll ever take with my money. Before Clara could respond, Matthew walked into the bathroom and closed the door, leaving her sitting alone with the devastating realization that her husband's calm acceptance wasn't forgiveness, it was preparation. Matthew Wilson had known about her betrayal for weeks, and he'd spent that time planning something she wasn't prepared for. Tomorrow morning would bring consequences that Clara couldn't imagine and couldn't prevent. The reckoning she'd been dreading was no longer approaching. It had already begun. Chapter 7. The Controlled Demolition. Monday morning arrived in Denver with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem sharper and more defined. Clara woke to the sound of Matthew moving through his usual morning routine, shower, coffee, checking construction schedules on his phone. The normalcy of his behavior only heightened her anxiety about his ominous words from the night before. At exactly 10 o'clock, as Matthew had specifically requested, the doorbell rang with the precise timing of a professionally scheduled appointment. Clara was in the kitchen, trying to force down coffee and toast while her stomach churned with anticipation. Through the front window, She could see a middle-aged man in a business suit standing on their porch, holding a manila envelope. "Clara Wilson?" the man asked when she opened the door. "Yes. You're being served with legal documents. Please sign here to acknowledge receipt." Clara's hands trembled as she signed the receipt form, her mind still trying to process what was happening. Divorce papers. Matthew was divorcing her. Despite knowing about her affair for weeks, despite acting calm and supportive, despite funding their trip to Hawaii, he had been planning to end their marriage with the cold precision he brought to construction projects. She tore open the envelope with shaking fingers, scanning the legal documents that would dismantle 19 years of marriage. Petition for dissolution of marriage, financial affidavits, asset division proposals, and attached to the back, a separate folder containing photographs, bank statements, hotel receipts, and a timeline documenting every lie she'd told for the past 18 months. The evidence was comprehensive and devastating. Matthew hadn't just discovered her affair. He'd documented it with the methodical thoroughness that made him successful in business. Every meeting with Stephen, every fabricated excuse, every dollar spent on their relationship. Clara's deception was laid out like a construction blueprint, complete with dates, times, and corroborating evidence. "Oh, God," Clara whispered, sinking onto the living room couch as the full scope of Matthew's preparation became clear. This wasn't an emotional reaction to betrayal. It was the systematic dismantling of their marriage by someone who'd had weeks to plan every detail. Haley emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the sound of the doorbell and her mother's obvious distress. When she saw the divorce papers scattered across the coffee table, her expression shifted from concern to something that looked almost like relief. "Dad knew," Haley said simply. "He's known all along." "You knew he knew?" Clara asked, staring at her daughter with growing horror. "I figured it out last night, when he made that comment about trust being the foundation of everything. Dad doesn't speak in metaphors unless he's making a point. And the way he handled our conversation about the trip, he was too calm, too prepared. He was waiting for something." Clara felt a surge of anger that temporarily overwhelmed her guilt. "So you've both been lying to me? You've both been planning this behind my back." "No, Mom. You've been lying to everyone. Dad and I are just dealing with the consequences of your choices." Before Clara could respond, the front door opened and Matthew walked in, checking his watch with the casual precision of someone following a carefully planned schedule. He looked at Clara sitting surrounded by divorce papers, then at Haley standing nearby with her arms crossed, and nodded as if confirming that everything was proceeding according to plan. "I see you've received the documents," Matthew said, hanging his jacket in the closet with the same routine he'd followed for years. "I thought it would be appropriate to discuss the practical details now that everything is official." "Matthew, please," Clara began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I've had weeks to listen to anything you might want to say, Clara. You've had plenty of opportunities to tell me about Stephen, about the hotels, about using our daughter as cover for your affair. You chose deception every time. Now we're past the point of discussion." Clara felt desperation clawing at her chest. The calm, final tone in Matthew's voice was more terrifying than anger would have been. "The man I thought I was having an affair with, Stephen, he's not who I thought he was. He's a con artist who manipulates women. I was stupid and deceived, but it wasn't real love. It was manipulation." "I know exactly who Stephen Waters is," Matthew replied. "I've known for 2 weeks. I also know about Kimberly Bentley, about his pattern of targeting women in vulnerable situations, and about his plans to use your money to fund his retreat center. Your relationship with a con artist doesn't change the fact that you chose to have an affair and steal from our marriage to pay for it." The weight of Matthew's comprehensive knowledge hit Clara like a physical blow. He hadn't just discovered her affair. He'd investigated it thoroughly enough to understand details she'd only learned herself in Hawaii. While she'd been rationalizing her behavior and planning romantic getaways, Matthew had been methodically documenting the destruction of their marriage. "What about our family?" Clara asked, grasping for any argument that might reach him. "What about Haley? We can work through this. I'll end things with Stephen completely. I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust." Matthew's expression didn't change. "Our family consists of Haley and me now. You forfeited your place when you decided to pursue another man using my money and my daughter as cover. There's no rebuilding trust with someone who spent 18 months systematically destroying it." Haley moved to stand beside her father, a gesture that Clara interpreted as choosing sides in the dissolution of their family. The sight of her daughter aligning with Matthew felt like the final confirmation that Clara had lost everything she'd once taken for granted. The house, the business, the money. You can't just take everything, Clara said, her voice rising with panic. Matthew retrieved a folder from his briefcase and handed it to Clara. The financial settlement is actually quite generous, considering the circumstances. You'll receive your portion of the house equity, half of our joint savings accounts, and a portion of my 401k. What you won't receive is spousal support, given that you used marital assets to fund an affair. Clara opened the folder, scanning the financial breakdown that would determine the rest of her life. The numbers were fair but stark, representing the end of the financial security that Matthew's success had provided for nearly 2 decades. I need a lawyer, Clara said, more to herself than to anyone else. That's your right, Matthew agreed. But I should mention that my attorney has already filed these papers with the court. The process has begun whether you contest it or not. You can hire representation to protect your interests, but you can't stop the divorce. Clara stared at the man she'd been married to for 19 years, trying to find some trace of the Matthew who'd loved her, trusted her, and built a life around making her happy. Instead, she saw only cold determination and the kind of strategic thinking that had made him successful in business. Is this really how you want to end things? Clara asked, making one final attempt to reach whatever remained of their emotional connection. Clara, this is how you ended things 18 months ago when you started sleeping with another man. I'm just making it official. Matthew gathered his briefcase and headed toward the front door, pausing only to address Haley. I'll be at the Morrison site until 5 if you need anything. We can discuss your summer work schedule when I get home. After he left, Clara and Haley sat in silence in the living room, surrounded by legal documents that represented the complete dismantling of their family structure. Clara felt hollowed out, as if everything she'd built her identity around had been surgically removed. I'm sorry you have to go through this, Clara said finally, looking at her daughter with genuine remorse. I'm not the one going through it, Mom, Haley replied quietly. You and Dad are. I'm just watching people I love destroy each other because one of them made selfish choices. The accuracy of Haley's assessment cut deeper than any legal document could. Clara had risked everything for a fantasy relationship with a man who'd never actually cared about her, and now she was facing the permanent consequences of her deception. Outside, Matthew Wilson drove toward his construction site with the satisfaction of seeing a carefully planned project executed flawlessly. The legal framework was in place, the evidence was documented, and the timeline was proceeding exactly as scheduled. But the legal divorce was only the first phase of Matthew's comprehensive plan. Clara and Stephen had used his trust and his money to build their relationship. Now Matthew would use their betrayal to construct something much more lasting. Consequences that would follow them long after the legal papers were finalized. The controlled demolition of his marriage was complete. Now it was time to begin construction on their punishment. Chapter 8. The Foundation of Consequences. The week following the divorce filing passed in a blur of legal consultations, financial inventories, and the grim logistics of dismantling 19 years of shared life. Clara hired William Wiley, a divorce attorney recommended by a friend, but even his experienced guidance couldn't alter the fundamental reality of her situation. Matthew's documentation was comprehensive, his legal strategy was sound, and Colorado's no-fault divorce laws meant that her affair, while morally devastating, didn't significantly impact the financial settlement. What Clara didn't know was that Matthew's legal strategy was only the beginning of a much more comprehensive plan for consequences. While she focused on protecting her financial interests in the divorce, Matthew was implementing the second phase of his blueprint for justice. Stephen Waters returned to Denver 3 days after Clara and Haley, his brief romantic adventure in Hawaii, having apparently run its course with Kimberly Bentley's rejection of his business proposal. He contacted Clara immediately upon his return, suggesting they meet at their usual hotel to discuss their future plans, now that her marriage was officially ending. Clara agreed to the meeting, partly out of curiosity about Stephen's intentions and partly from a desperate need to salvage something meaningful from the wreckage of her life. If her marriage to Matthew was truly over, perhaps her relationship with Stephen could still develop into something genuine and lasting. The Marriott hotel meeting felt different from their previous encounters. Stephen seemed distracted and less charming than usual, checking his phone frequently and showing little interest in Clara's emotional turmoil over the divorce proceedings. "I've been thinking about our situation," Stephen said after they'd been together for less than an hour. "With your divorce moving forward, things are going to get complicated. Maybe we should take a break from seeing each other until your legal situation is resolved." Clara stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "A break? Stephen, I've left my husband for you. I've destroyed my marriage because I thought we had something real together." "You left your husband because you were unhappy in your marriage," Stephen corrected. "Our relationship was part of your journey toward authenticity, but it doesn't mean we're automatically committed to each other long-term." The casual cruelty of his dismissal was breathtaking. Clara realized that Stephen had never viewed their affair as the profound connection she'd imagined. To him, she'd been a convenient source of attention, money, and sexual gratification. Now that her usefulness was ending and her situation was becoming complicated, he was discarding her with the same emotional efficiency he'd shown other women. "What about all the things you said about spiritual connection and finding our authentic selves together?" Clara asked, her voice rising with desperation. "Those were concepts we explored during our time together. They weren't promises about the future." Clara left the hotel feeling more devastated than she had after receiving the divorce papers. Matthew's rejection had been cold but predictable. She'd betrayed his trust and destroyed their marriage. Stephen's rejection was casual and dismissive, revealing that their entire affair had been built on her delusions about his feelings and intentions. What Clara didn't know was that Stephen's sudden desire for distance wasn't entirely his own decision. Earlier that week, Matthew had paid Stephen a visit at his apartment on Compass Street, a conversation that had significantly altered Stephen's perspective on his relationship with Clara. The visit had begun with Matthew introducing himself as Clara's husband and stating that he knew about their affair. Stephen had initially attempted to maintain his practiced charm, expressing regret about the situation and claiming that his relationship with Clara had developed naturally out of their shared spiritual interests. Matthew had listened patiently to Stephen's explanation, then presented him with a comprehensive file documenting his pattern of targeting vulnerable women for financial and emotional exploitation. The file included statements from Viola Galloway and 3 other women who'd been manipulated by Stephen over the past 5 years, financial records showing his use of relationship funds for personal business ventures, and evidence of his simultaneous pursuit of multiple women in different cities. "I'm not here to threaten you about my wife," Matthew had said calmly. "What Clara chose to do was her decision, and she'll face the consequences of that choice. But I want you to understand that I know exactly who you are and what you do." Stephen had tried to maintain his composure, but Matthew's evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss or explain away. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to end your relationship with Clara immediately and permanently. I want you to reject any future contact from her. And I want you to understand that if you ever target another woman the way you've targeted my wife, I'll make sure every potential victim knows exactly what kind of man you are." Matthew had then presented Stephen with copies of documents he'd prepared for distribution, detailed profiles of Stephen's manipulative patterns, testimonials from his previous victims, and evidence of his fraudulent business practices. The documents were professionally formatted and ready for distribution to yoga studios, retreat centers, and spiritual communities throughout Colorado. "I've had these prepared but not distributed," Matthew explained. "Whether they ever see public circulation depends entirely on your future behavior. If you disappear from Clara's life completely and cease your pattern of targeting vulnerable women, they remain private. If you continue manipulating women or maintain any contact with my wife, they'll be distributed widely enough to end your current business model permanently." Stephen had understood the terms immediately. Matthew wasn't just ending his affair with Clara. He was threatening to destroy Stephen's entire method of operation. The choice was simple: disappear from Clara's life and find a new way to make a living, or face exposure that would make his manipulative tactics impossible to continue. The conversation had ended with Stephen's agreement to Matthew's terms, though he'd tried to maintain some dignity by claiming he'd been planning to end things with Clara anyway. Matthew had left Stephen's apartment confident that the affair was over and that Stephen would have strong motivation to avoid any future contact with Clara. 3 days later, When Stephen met Clara at the hotel to end their relationship, he was operating under the knowledge that Matthew Wilson wasn't just a betrayed husband. He was a strategist who'd thoroughly researched Stephen's vulnerabilities and was prepared to destroy his livelihood if necessary. Stephen's dismissal of Clara was therefore not just personal disinterest, but a calculated decision to protect himself from Matthew's promised consequences. He couldn't tell Clara about Matthew's visit without admitting to the evidence of his manipulative pattern, so he simply implemented the breakup in the most efficient way possible. Clara returned home from the hotel meeting feeling completely hollowed out. She'd lost her marriage, her family's respect, and now the relationship she'd sacrificed everything to pursue. The man she'd thought was her soulmate had revealed himself to be exactly what Haley had discovered in her research, a practiced manipulator who'd never cared about her as anything more than a convenient source of emotional and financial support. That evening, as Clara sat alone in the house that would soon no longer be her home, she began to understand the full scope of what Matthew had constructed during his weeks of preparation. He hadn't just filed for divorce. He'd systematically dismantled every aspect of the life she'd tried to build outside their marriage. Matthew Wilson had promised that this was how their story would end, and Clara was beginning to realize that his version of justice was far more comprehensive and permanent than she'd imagined. The foundation of consequences was solid, and the structure Matthew was building on top of it would last much longer than any marriage. Chapter 9. The Final Blueprint. 6 weeks after the divorce papers were served, Clara Wilson, soon to be Clara Alexander, having decided to reclaim her maiden name, sat in the law office of William Wiley, signing the final documents that would officially end her 19-year marriage to Matthew. The settlement had been finalized exactly as Matthew's initial filing had proposed, with no modifications or negotiations. Clara received half of their joint savings, her portion of the house equity, and a portion of Matthew's retirement fund. What she didn't receive was any ongoing financial support or claim to Wilson Construction's future earnings. At 41 years old, she was starting over with enough money to purchase a modest condominium and support herself for perhaps 2 years if she lived carefully. The dissolution will be final in 90 days, William explained as Clara signed the last document. After that, you'll be legally free to remarry or make any other life changes you choose. The irony of the comment wasn't lost on Clara. She was indeed free to make life changes, but Stephen Waters had vanished from her life as completely as if he'd never existed. Her calls went unanswered, her texts were ignored, and when she'd driven past his apartment building, she'd discovered he'd moved out without leaving a forwarding address. Sacred Balance Studio informed her that Stephen was no longer affiliated with their program, and they had no information about his current location or plans. It was as if the man who'd convinced her to risk everything for spiritual authenticity had simply evaporated once the practical consequences of their affair became real. Clara suspected Matthew was somehow responsible for Stephen's disappearance, but she had no evidence and no way to prove her suspicions. Stephen's abandonment felt like the final confirmation that their entire relationship had been built on her delusions about his character and intentions. The house on Maple Street sold within 2 weeks of being listed, purchased by a young family who admired the craftsmanship and attention to detail that Matthew had put into every room. Clara packed her belongings with mechanical efficiency, separating 19 years of accumulated possessions into categories: things that would fit in her new condominium, things to donate, and things to discard. Matthew maintained his polite distance throughout the process, handling all interactions through lawyers or brief, practical conversations about logistics. When Clara tried to engage him in discussions about their shared history or the possibility of maintaining some kind of friendship for Haley's sake, his responses were courteous but final. "We don't have a shared future to discuss, Clara," he said during one of their last conversations in the house they'd built together. "You made choices that ended our relationship permanently. Now we're just completing the practical details of separating our lives." Haley had begun working for Wilson Construction immediately after graduation, starting in the office but quickly moving to job sites where she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of project management and quality control. Matthew took obvious pride in her natural abilities, and Clara watched with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak as her daughter developed the kind of close working relationship with her father that Clara had never managed to achieve in their marriage. She's got the mind for this business, Matthew told Clara during Haley's second week of work. Attention to detail, ability to see how all the pieces fit together, and the patience to get things right the first time. She reminds me of myself at her age, except she's already more diplomatic with difficult clients than I've ever been. Clara could see that Haley was thriving in the construction environment, learning skills that would serve her well regardless of what career she ultimately chose. More importantly, Haley was building a relationship with Matthew based on mutual respect and shared accomplishments, rather than the emotional manipulation that had characterized Clara's approach to family relationships. The final revelation of Matthew's comprehensive planning came during Clara's last week in the house, when she discovered a letter he'd left for her in the bedroom they'd shared for 19 years. The envelope was marked for Clara, after the divorce is final, in Matthew's precise handwriting. Inside was a single page, typed with the same attention to detail Matthew brought to construction contracts. Clara, by the time you read this, our marriage will be legally over and you'll be preparing to start your new life. I want you to understand that everything that happened after I discovered your affair was carefully planned and deliberately executed. You spent 18 months lying to me, stealing from our marriage to fund your relationship with another man, and using our daughter as cover for your betrayal. You had numerous opportunities to tell me the truth or end your affair, but you chose deception every time. I spent 3 weeks documenting your betrayal and planning the most effective way to end our marriage while protecting my business and my relationship with Haley. Every action I took was calculated to achieve a specific result. Stephen Waters will never contact you again because I made it clear that doing so would result in the destruction of his business model. The evidence I presented to him about his pattern of manipulating women was comprehensive enough to end his career if it became public knowledge. The divorce settlement was designed to provide you with enough resources to start over, but not enough to live comfortably without working. You'll need to build a new life through your own efforts, not through dependency on someone else's labor. Haley chose to work for my company because she recognizes the difference between people who build things through honest work and people who take things through manipulation and deception. She's learning skills that will serve her throughout her life, and she's doing it in an environment based on trust and mutual respect. I don't hate you, Clara, but I don't forgive you either. What you did to our marriage and our family was unforgivable, and I wanted you to understand that the consequences you're facing weren't accidental or emotional. They were planned and implemented with the same precision I bring to any major construction project. You built a relationship with Stephen on the foundation of lies and stolen money. I built your consequences on the foundation of truth and documented evidence. Which structure do you think will last longer? Matthew. Clara read the letter 3 times, each reading making the scope of Matthew's planning more clear. He hadn't just reacted to her betrayal. He'd architected her consequences with the same methodical precision that had made him successful in business. Every element of her current situation, from Stephen's disappearance to the financial settlement to Haley's career choice, had been anticipated and planned. Matthew Wilson had promised her that this was how their story would end, and he delivered exactly what he'd promised. Clara was free to start over, but she was starting with the understanding that the man she'd betrayed for 19 years was far more strategic and unforgiving than she'd ever realized. The final irony was that Stephen Waters, the man who'd taught Clara about authentic living and following your true path, had been the first to abandon her when following that path became difficult. Matthew, the man she dismissed as too stable and predictable, had proven to be the most ruthless and effective strategist she'd ever encountered. Clara folded the letter and placed it in her purse, a document she would keep as a reminder of the difference between trust and naivety, between love and manipulation, and between consequences and forgiveness. As she drove away from the house on Maple Street for the last time, Clara could see Matthew and Haley in the driveway, loading construction equipment into his truck for another day of building something meant to last. They were working together with the easy efficiency of people who understood each other completely, creating something solid and permanent through honest labor and mutual respect. Clara had chosen excitement over stability, fantasy over reality, and deception over truth. Now she was free to discover what kind of life she could build on her own, without the security of Matthew's success or the illusion of Stephen's affection. The foundation she was starting with was exactly what she deserved: Nothing more and nothing less than the consequences of her own choices. Matthew Wilson had built his life on the principle that trust was the foundation of everything worth building. Clara had learned, too late, that some foundations couldn't be repaired once they were destroyed. The architect of her consequences had created something that would last much longer than any marriage. The permanent understanding that betrayal always came with a price, and some people were patient enough to ensure that price was paid in full. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.